Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Rogers, I need some clarification of what your responsibilities are in Cyber Command. Are you responsible for protecting this country from cyber attacks on private networks and corporations, or is it simply government networks?
So DoD has a responsibility to defend critical infrastructure against events of significant cyber consequence.
So critical infrastructure, that, for example, in Maine, in May, we had 3 urgent care centers that were hacked. We had Maine General Health, which is one of our major health care, they were hacked. Is that part of your, what's the definition of critical infrastructure?
Yeah, there are 16 segments that the federal government has identified as having significant implications for the nation's security, but the second component, I would argue, of the definition I gave you of the mission is not just the sector that was attacked, so to speak, but also the magnitude of the event. In DoD, we use the phrase significant cyber consequence. The concern being the Department of Defense is not resourced, nor is it currently tasked with defending every single computer structure within the United States. And so we try to identify where can our finite resources be best applied. And so they're focused on those 16 segments that have been designated as critical to the nation's infrastructure, and then tripped in those circumstances in which the actions against one of those 16 segments reaches significant cyber consequence.
But in terms of national defense, it's death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, we're being hacked every day in insurance companies, businesses. Some of it is cyber espionage, as you point out, but some of it is some of it's criminal. But it seems to me we need to be thinking about who is responsible. I mean, I understand you don't call out the Army if there's a criminal in one town. You have local police, but there's a gap here. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
There's a gap in our defenses because we really don't have the infrastructure of the state police or local police that would protect local interests when they're being attacked, and you have the expertise. We have to work out something as between Cyber Command and local law enforcement, if you will, to protect us from these repeated and continuous and escalating attacks.
Although if I could, I'd urge us to think more broadly than just Cyber Command. I think the challenge is, how do we harness the capacity and capability that is resident within our government structure, teamed with the capabilities that are resident in the private sector? It's much bigger than just, don't get me wrong, we're definitely a part of this. But I always urge people, we have got to think much more broadly than
well,
just
I think that's a good way to articulate it. We keep talking in these hearings, when are we going to have a well-developed and articulated cyber deterrent strategy? And I emphasize in my notes, I underline the word articulated. It's not deterrence if it's not articulated. But we need definition of what is an act of war, what is a proportional response, what is a mutually assured destruction situation. This, it seems to me, is this in the works, and if so, when?
I mean, sir, I don't have a date for you. That's well beyond the mission set of U.S. Cyber Command. I am part of those discussions. I'm the first to acknowledge that. I try to provide an input and just be one voice as to what I think is the direction broadly that we need to go. I apologize, Senator. I don't have a specific date or timeline for you.
It just seems to me that as a matter of policy, that we really need this. This needs to happen. We've been talking about this as long as I've been on this committee, and we aren't there yet. And yet, something terrible is going to happen, and a lot of people are going to say, "Well, why didn't we have a policy? Why don't we have a deterrent policy?"
Yes,
so, I would urge you and the councils of the administration to push for a sense of urgency on this question, because if all we do is defense and there's no deterrence, ultimately we're going to lose that battle.
Yes, sir. It's a losing strategy.
Final point, and I know that you talked about this earlier, I'm finding it harder and harder to justify you're holding 2 jobs, given the complexity. I mean, this arrangement was created in 2009, which in technological terms is a century ago, and I just can't. I mean, I understand the relationship between NSA and Cyber Command, but particularly if we move in the direction, which I think we are, of setting up Cyber Command as its own independent combatant command, to have the same person trying to run those 2 agencies, I just think is impractical and almost impossible.
I've been doing it for 2 years to date.
And you've been doing it very well.
So as I said in my initial comment, I agree that it's something we need to continue to assess. I agree that in the long run, the probably best course of action is to ultimately put both organizations in a position where they're capable of executing their mission in a complementary and aligned way, but in a more separate way. But the reality is we're just not ready to do that today, I believe. Now, don't get me wrong, if I am ordered or directed, I get paid to make things happen, and I will execute it to the best of my ability.
But I take it you agree that we should Cyber Command should be its own combatant command.
I do, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.